Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second session of Graphic Content, Drawing as Method. My name is Jesse Le Cavalier. I am a member of the faculty here at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this second session. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. I'd like to also note that this event is being live streamed and recorded. If you do not wish to be captured, you could just turn off your video, and if you don't mind keeping yourself muted during the presentation. So it's so great to see you all. I know a few of you I recognize from our first session. So I'm delighted that you're with us here still. But I know there's also some people joining for the first time, and so for that I'd like to. There's a few things I'd like to do just to kind of remind or describe some of the things that are going on, and to offer a few notes of thanks before introducing this session's topic and speakers. So this conference, it's a 2-day conference that brings together a group of scholars whose research applies techniques of representation that's more connected to design disciplines, but to larger topics in the built environment. And one of the assertions of the conference is that, taken all together, this use of these representational, analytical, or synthetic techniques under this broader umbrella of drawing is constitutive of a research method in its own right. And so if one of the questions around research in general is about how it structures inquiry and pursuit of new knowledge, it would follow that this kind of expanded methodological repertoire would create new opportunities for increased knowledge production, and perhaps even in a very kind of particularly effective way through drawing itself. So the group here across all the sessions are collectively, I think, make a powerful case that graphic production offers ways to effectively communicate findings in unique ways, that it suggests a restructured form of agency, and it also can illuminate unexpected pathways for research, future research. So a few notes of thanks before we get going. The first is to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the SSHRC. C is for Canada. The Connections program through the SSHRC provided the main bulk of the funding that makes this event possible. Some of that funding was matched from the Daniels faculty and Dean Rob Wright. So thank you also to the Daniels and to Dean Wright. It also would not be possible without the amazing efforts of the Public Events Office, Nini Brode, and Cowling, Tim Clark. All of those folks are doing amazing work to keep it all running. And then special thanks to Farah Michelle, who is the production and research assistant for the project, who's been there working together with me from the beginning, even before we started writing the grant. So Farah, thank you again for your effort and dedication. Wouldn't be possible without you. And then finally, thanks to Ali Kadir, the graphic designer, who put together this brilliant graphic program for the event. So thank you, Ali, for all of your help. And then thanks again to all of you, braving the kind of ups and downs of a already overexposed term, with Zoom fatigue being real. I totally appreciate that you're still subjecting yourself to more of it in order to join us for this conversation. So thanks in advance for that. And one other thing, what in the context of what we're doing. I mean, I mentioned this in the other session as well, that we're in the first year of a new PhD program at the Daniels in architecture, landscape, and design, and it's an interdisciplinary program. And this conference for me is an opportunity to explore what it might mean to have such a program. What does it mean to actually do an interdisciplinary project, and to do an interdisciplinary to create an interdisciplinary work that takes advantage of a set of skills, of métiers that come from the architectural world. And so this is one of the things that I'm hoping to explore with this event in general. And with this session in particular, one of the things that I'm interested in is, or one of the things I hope we might explore, is the ways that set of expanded techniques of graphic exploration and representational exploration might open up onto other pathways of work, of different kinds of ways of engagement or modes of agency. And I think the two presenters and then the respondent today, all of you, I think, bring a totally significant and I think very exciting perspective on that question. So as these visualization processes evolve, we have new possibilities that might emerge. And to if I could read a short passage from a quite significant recent publication called Architects After Architecture. The editors write that the architect here, as in this new phase, is recast as a creative mediator, bridging between different forms of knowledge, seeking clarity amongst complexity, bringing together disparate communities, building and combining emotional power with pragmatic potential. So in other words, sort of moving past the form-making architect, but seeking out the ways that architecture, broadly construed, can form new relationships in pursuit of effective public engagement. And I think this is something that we see in the work of both of Sandra Yucana and Luke Pearson and Nerea Cavillo. So the way, and then of course Rory Hyde, our respondent. So the way that the session will unfold, I'll introduce Sandra and Luke first. We'll hear from them, then I'll introduce Nerea, and then after her presentation, I'll introduce Rory, and then after his response, conversation can follow. And as in the previous session, you're welcome to post any questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to fold those into the conversation. And so let me conclude by introducing Luke Pearson and Sandra Yucana of UNP, who are both teaching at the University College London, but also started this practice UNP which is an architectural design studio, but that explores the integration of video technologies into architectural design, and through that work opens up conversations about this immense sphere of cultural production within the context of urbanization. And so Sandra and Luke, they lead a studio at the Bartlett at UCL called Video Game Urbanism, where they explore the ways that game technologies can be used in the context of speculative urban design projects. And they've been working across an incredible range of scales, including some recent projects include the project Playing the Picturesque for the Royal Institute of British Architects and the London Developers Toolkit for the Architekturmuseum in Munich. And they also are active theorists of this, and currently you can find their writing throughout all of the interesting architectural publications, including Volume and eFlux and Architectural Design. And then they're currently working on a larger project, the Video Game Atlas, looking at different ways that architecture and video games intersect. And I think that from one of the reasons that there's many reasons I'm excited that you guys are joining us today, but particularly in this context of questions about drawing, one of the things that I think is significant about the work you're doing is that there's an engagement with it as this form of creative production and creative practice, and there's also knowing the broader kind of space of your work that there's also a commitment to and fascination with the kind of disciplinary legacies of architectural drawing. And so I think the way this is all situated for me makes you perfectly situated to address that. So I'm really grateful that you could make the time, and also that you could stay up a little late, or stay in on a Friday night, I guess. So I'm also grateful for that. So anyway, with that, I'll turn it over. Please join me in welcoming Luke Pearson and Sandra Ukana.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks, everyone. It's really great to be here. And yeah, we're missing such a great party, obviously not. No, what a cool event to be a part of. And yeah, we're really excited for this session as well.
Yeah, thanks for such a kind introduction. It made us sound very fancy.
Yeah, it did.
So if you just give us a sec, we'll try and do our PowerPoint trick so that we can share things and keep on time. Okay, so.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So yeah, the title of our talk today is from drawing space to game space and back again. So I guess we'd just like to really talk about some of the drawing practices that we engage with, and how those kind of connect to the practices that we're developing, as Jesse said, between the spheres of architectural design and games design. So for a bit of a background about us, we have a sort of interdisciplinary design studio called UMP, and we make design projects which seek to redefine the traditional tools of the architect and engage with pop culture and technology. So we've done things like I think many of them have been described really well already. But like new mapping languages, we've constructed giant binary adding computers. We've turned Japanese arcade games into kind of urban design plans. We've kind of looked at the language of toys as a way of making analytical tools to understand like Disney's urbanism. And we've also made physical games as well, which we've exhibited at a number of games festivals and events in London, where we're kind of interested in allowing people to understand the urban morphology of cities, but also to bring different generations together to kind of create things through our game systems.
Yeah, and as part of this kind of emerging agenda that we have together 4 years ago, or this is its 5th year, we formed a research laboratory at the Bartlett in London, which is called Video Game Urbanism, which we were just introduced to. And this was really a kind of experiment to exclusively focus on video games as a medium within the kind of architecture school and academic context. And primarily, we were really excited about using this as a way of engaging new audiences and different participants into the design of cities. So we've been working with our students on some really, really exciting kind of themes and topics, and we've collaborated with cultural institutions and industry partners as well. So yeah, while we kind of focus primarily on making playable video games, as you saw in the previous page, it kind of crossed lots of different mediums to kind of get here as well. And we're really interested in the ever expanding culture of games, be that kind of physical, participatory, or what we kind of generally conceive as a typical game as well.
Yeah, obviously you can see some drawings on the walls as well, and we'll discuss a bit more about that kind of methodology later. But we also come from a background of using critical drawings ourselves. So in earlier forms of our education, we've always had a long interest in video games growing up, but we've also had an interest in the virtual space of the drawing space as well. And so we've done a lot of projects in the past that have used drawings, that have used hand drawings, for instance, to look at the transcription of space, or a way of kind of re-representing history, or of melding kind of fact and fiction together. And I think this has formed a basis for the way that we continue to look at our work, even while we're using kind of, more, let's say, the contemporary technologies of the video game, which is still in its relationship to architecture quite an emerging discipline. What this has also allowed us to do, I think, and maybe this is something that Jesse touched on as well, is that a lot of our work also connects back to kind of architectural history, and in particular, perhaps the history of representation in architecture. And so I think there's a kind of innate connection in the way that we also see games and kind of deal with them.
So how do our drawings kind of interrogate virtual space? So yeah, we've researched a lot into kind of commercial games such as Grand Theft Auto 5, and we've used the game as a basis to kind of create hybridized mappings, drawings that emphasize these virtual worlds, kind of not only as representations of space, but also by how they're regulated by systems that control the kind of experience of the player within the world as well.
Yeah, and I think the point to make here is that what our drawing tries to do is to reflect the fact that to experience a game space is to be enmeshed in the interplay between the sort of represented rules and the represented world, and the rules which structure your kind of being and your ability to interact with that world. It's also very common in games to obviously have an interplay between what you could call the diegetic and non-diegetic systems of the game. So the narrative of the world that you're in, and then the sort of meta-narrative of all of the game statistics, all of the user interface and your health and the objects you might have collected and things like that. So we try to use drawing as a way of kind of collapsing this to see it as one space.
Yeah, and this is something that we've expanded on in a kind of visual manifesto for Volume magazine, as was mentioned earlier as well. So this was a kind of playful and visual interrogation of a written thesis and how the kind of drawn examinations brought together as one piece, which is neither drawing or text to be read exclusively, but together as one kind of visual manifesto.
And yeah, I think, as Jesse said, we're currently working on a bigger project, which is a book called the Video Game Atlas for Thames and Hudson. And here we're interrogating 12 commercial video games, some really big games, some quite small niche games. But really the idea of this is to use drawing and mapping and data mining and other kind of tools as a way of critically kind of unpicking the architecture of these game worlds. And so that might actually be quite different to maybe the act of designing a game world from the game designer's perspective, but we're trying to use the protocols of architectural drawing as a way of kind of studying and revealing new knowledge about these worlds.
Yeah, so some of these things you can see, maybe you'll recognize them, whether that's the kind of facades of Animal Crossing or the kind of access to the island that you get as you progress through the game, or some of the different mission zones and navigation meshes, that's a mouthful, of Grand Theft Auto as well.
And yeah, as we say, the drawing really allows us to put these video game worlds in architectural terms. And I think in a way that, again, allows us to sort of see the video game space through the lens of architectural representation, and by association, the lens of the way that architectural space is kind of analysed and understood. So for instance, in the left-hand drawing, we're looking at the game Katamari Damacy, where you kind of roll this giant ball up and it picks up all these objects. And in this case, it's a sort of domestic Japanese house space, which is then kind of taken over by this ball, which is collecting things, and we're analysing that.
Yeah, with this one in particular, the gameplay is so immediate and so kind of fast-paced. To make this drawing probably took it did take many hours, even though you're only in the level for about 3 minutes. So there's something really fascinating to us about unpicking that experience and transcribing it into a drawing.
Yeah, and then on the right-hand side, we're again looking at Grand Theft Auto, but looking at the fact that in video game spaces, the visual depiction of the world and the kind of physics systems of the world, they don't have to be connected together. So actually, when you look at a palm tree, it's actually a series of these kind of funny little forms and things like that, which are regulating the physics, but are different from the world that's depicted to us. And so our drawing practice is also being used to, I guess, as we say, explore the history of the virtual, but also how drawings and virtual spaces can extend the extents of our physical world. So this was a series of artifacts that we made for the Victoria and Albert Museum a few years ago, which were in the medieval and Renaissance galleries, and appeared as a series of kind of drawn portals into game worlds. And so we're really interested by connecting the kind of various different architectural fragments within that gallery to the way that video game space is often made through kind of collage and fragmentation in a way. So we took elements from commercial games such as Prey on the left-hand side and BioShock on the right-hand side, and we introduced them into the gallery space as a way of kind of questioning the spatial fragmentation. And then the idea, these are two kind of things, portals inspired literally by the game Portal, but also here I believe that these doorways were from Genoa, and the doorways were incredibly ornate because the building facade might be quite small, so the doorway had to kind of communicate the grandeur of the architecture beyond it. So in a sense, the doorways are already portals, and so we wanted to connect them to this idea that there might be this virtual palace kind of lurking behind.
Yeah, by superimposing them onto these, culturally significant objects as well, we want to also propose the idea that these game spaces and that we inhabit are also as culturally important too.
And so, of course, architectural drawing, and it contains lots of protocols and lots of different kind of rules, and that has again an innate connection to our understanding of space and the way that we can articulate it and what type of architecture emerges from that. So this was a project that we did for the RIBA a few years ago, a little sort of first thing that we did with them, which was looking at the perspective studies of Hans Vredeman de Vries, who made these kind of perspectival architectural spaces through drawing. So this was a game called Projectives, which was designed for 4 players who would work together to recompose Vredeman de Vries's perspectival studies as an idealized perspective scene. Might need to.
If you can.
I don't know. Okay. Well, this might be. So we'll get to it in a minute once the loading screen goes past.
Beautiful loading screen.
Yeah, very minimal loading screen. So each player navigates the world through one of 4 different perspectives. One player is in plan, one player is in isometric, one player is in first person, one player is in elevation. And so in a sense, what we were interested here is in how these 4 different kind of viewpoints for these virtual avatars could be, again, collapsed into the flat space of the screen to produce these kind of perspectival architectures that de Vries was proposing in these drawings.
And as a collaborative kind of experience, to be able to negotiate and find your way through and communicate with one another to essentially compose the view of the drawing that you were initially shown.
And what we're interested in is things like digital materials where they can be unlit, which means they don't receive light, which means that 2 different viewpoints can bleed into one another and still create the same kind of perspectival representation at the end. So we'll skip forward, but in the end you recreate this room through these 4 views. But actually it's a city that's composed of 4 differently scaled kind of territories that the player moves through. So this brings us on to another kind of practice. I think the last drawing is kind of a hint at this, which is what we call screenshot drawings, which is to say that screenshots, this is the game No Man's Sky, screenshots are usually used by the games industry as a way of selling and marketing worlds or to create social interaction, but they're generally conceived of more as photography rather than drawings. And so, sorry.
Go ahead. So in contrast, I suppose we've kind of generated this screenshot practice where we kind of take many different views from our game worlds and compress them together in a similar way to the mappings, kind of breaking the experience down and allowing us to express the more temporal and interactive dimensions of our games through drawing, using the world itself as the kind of raw material. So this is an extract from our project Playing the Picturesque, where we were able to combine 5 different game worlds designed to explore the architecture of John Nash, bringing them together into one kind of virtual landscape within the drawing.
Yeah, I think it also exposes some of the kind of artifice of the game worlds we create. Like, for instance, the trees in our world, they're all flat. And although they're very colourful, the actual kind of form of them is all taken from Humphrey Repton's drawings that he did for his Red Book for Blaise Castle, which is a kind of historical landscape architecture project.
And then we did a kind of a similar technique for another iteration of the project, which was in Bath, focused on this kind of Palladian bridge and how there were different multiple historic connections and memories within the architecture and the game mechanisms and how they might be combined and interacted with.
Yeah. And so this was a drawing from a project called the Church of Co-Location that was commissioned for a festival in Glasgow in Scotland a couple of years ago. And we were looking at the idea of data centers occupying churches. The sort of project was about reconstituting typologies. And so in this case, we made this kind of data center within a church, but the stained glass was kind of replaced by a series of these portals, which would take you into the various different worlds or the various different types of information that would be stored within this data center. So each one of these worlds was a kind of world within a world that the player could explore, but we kind of used the drawing to enmesh them together, not maybe in the same way that a game like a game map might be found in a guidebook that shows you how to, like, you know, find your way through the space, but more as a way of kind of, I guess, composing the sort of territory of the game, and the fact that actually within this data center these things wouldn't be stored in such a kind of linear fashion, but they would be, you know, kind of interconnected and woven together.
And this is something we've worked on in our teaching studio. So these are a couple of student drawings. So it was about reimagining the planning notice as a kind of three-dimensional interactive interface. So they were really challenging the kind of semantics and language of the notice, and allow people to be able to create and upload their own structures. So yeah, the drawing became a way of kind of conceptualizing the potential of the game, both as a kind of landscape of objects, but also as a, you know, augmented reality planning notice.
Yeah, and this was another student project called Kintsugi City. And so it was a project that was about different views through Tokyo, developed through a series of spatial fragments inspired by kintsugi, which is the art of Japanese pottery repair. So here the drawings show the movement of the player as they manipulate the hundreds of objects in the game world. Each fragment was actually designed around its kind of view as it was seen in perspective, but through these overall drawings they can start to demonstrate their game as a field of objects, and that each one of those objects has a kind of individual agency in relation to the player.
A role in the game.
And so finally, I think we're interested in games, in how games might become, they already are. I think that's definitely not up for debate, but how games are cultural software in their own right and can be used creatively. And so this is, as Jesse said, this is the London Developers Toolkit made for the Architecture Museum de Tum in Munich. And it was a video game connected to a printer and to a social media feed where players would basically create their own architectural advertisements for a luxury high-rise building at the behest of a developer. You can see them on the screen. So you could actually go into the gallery and kind of create your own architectural drawings. And so the game, I apologize for this super sped up sound, but the game interface itself involves gesture recognition, where the player draws directly onto the game to show their architectural napkin sketches have sufficient artistic inspiration. And they undergo a series of slightly basic tasks and produce this kind of randomly generated high-rise luxury tower with different kind of cutesy components, which are derived partly from fact and partly from fiction. And the end of the game is a form of crap Photoshop, we call it, where the player can manipulate various different elements. They can put the building in different contexts. They can put different kind of aspirational figures into their image, and they can put different effects. And so really for us, the game questions kind of comes full circle and questions the relationship between architectural image making and the systems of capital that are completely remaking parts of London like Nine Elms, and really directly connects the game space and the drawing space together. And then the game crashes at the end.
So thank you, that was us. And yeah, you can see more of our work here.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you both. Luke and Sandra, that's there's a lot to think about here, and also I feel like we should have built in like a 45-minute demo version where we could all sort of now just kind of like log on and enjoy ourselves a little bit. But work continues, so I am going to keep us moving. But I think this is a great thank you for the contribution, and I think that the next part. So I think that so our next speaker is Nuria Calvillo. What I was going to say is I think that one of the, I'm excited about the this panel, because I think that, you know, there's a diversity to the perspectives. I think the work, and I think Nerea, you know, was working on a different set of questions, but I think there's a fair amount of I think potential overlaps around these questions of methodology. So I'm super happy to be introducing Nerea, who I have known since we were working together in a collaborative project through the Institute of Public Knowledge at NYU, and together on a shared research project about smart cities. And I think, if I may, Nerea is one of the rare kinds of scholars who is smartly looking at smart cities, and we need more people to be critically looking at this question. And I think Nerea's work is a great model of that. And so Nerea is currently based at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick, and is the co-director of the Spatial Design Office CEMAS Arquitectas, and is a founder of In the Air, which is an ongoing collaborative project about sensing the air and air pollution, something we'll hear about. So significantly, Nerea brings backgrounds from architecture and research together, and brings that to bear at the intersection of architecture, feminist technoscience, environmental studies, and her current work is on toxic politics, pollen, atmospheres, and queer urban political ecologies, and coming together in a book manuscript called Aeropolis. And one of the reasons I'm really happy, Nerea, that you're here today, because I really appreciate the way that you look at things you look at, because it feels like it's from a position of kind of necessity. And this is something we talked about a little bit in the first session, that the ways that our methodologies take shape is because we have to do something in a certain way. And I get that feeling from what I know of your work, that you're looking at this sort of question of sensing because this is what you have to do the things you want to do. And I really appreciate that aspect of it, because it's driven by a kind of, you know, sincere engagement with the question and a kind of curiosity about how to understand it. And so I really admire the work, and I'm really grateful that you're here to share it with us. So would you join me in welcoming Nerea Cavia? Nerea, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Jesse, for such a generous and lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to think with you, as always. So, and a luxury to be part of this really exciting conference. And okay, I'm gonna get it started. So thanks for the invitation. And disclaimer, after the drawings that we've seen, I don't know, this is a little bit embarrassing. I feel like a grandma or something, but it's a different type of work. So, okay. So, hold on. Excuse me, I'm gonna set the timer otherwise. Visualizations of invisible agents as experimental methods to think with the environment. An alternative title of this talk, which I was unsure which one to choose, would be Methodological Reflections on the Role of the Graphic Seed of My PhD. And these reflections, these methodological reflections, I've had to reflect on, if you will, or come up with to defend or justify the seed of my PhD as an architecture, as an activist project. So, and this is interesting because on the one hand, all this process comes as a necessity, but another part of the process comes as the need to justify and therefore to find the potential of what we does in the world. Let's see if this makes sense as we go. So the seed of something that ended up being my PhD, but I had no idea, of course, at the time, is a collaborative project called In the Air that started in 2008 in Media Lab Prado Madrid as part of a workshop on visualizing data. This presentation, this reflection on methods comes from a paper that I wrote in trying to think about digital visualizations as an STS method, science and technology as a tool to research within science and technology, which is mostly a text-based discipline. And also thinking about, in another text, slowing data in reflecting on the process of the making of the visualizations. And of course, Jesse's challenge, drawing as a method, and our first interaction was, I don't draw. I haven't drawn in I don't know how many years. Only when I design, and that they're crappy drawings. So but then it has made me think on the relationships and the connections and the differences between visualizations and drawings, and without wanting to go into classifying things, but I think it's interesting to think about the different potentials and the different methods that thinking about it in one way or the other might bring to the fore. And then this question of agency that I had kind of scattered in this methodological thinking, but now I've tried to put it together and see whether we can make sense of it in a more straightforward way. A couple of disclaimers. If normally we speak about drawings as tools to unpack complexity, find patterns, communicate, and so forth, I'm going to be thinking about drawing as an activity, as a practice, to collaborate, ask questions, speculate, and experience stuff. Basically, our object of study. And when I speak about visualizations, I am moving away from the classical traditional literature on visualizations from Tafte and so on, many of them from scientific or computing contexts, where visualization's role is to communicate efficiently data. And my interest in visualizations is precisely on the contrary, on the opposite spectrum of this idea, is to create complexity, excess, and create other connections without losing the precision of what a scientific visualization might be. Making the atmosphere visible has been, since Boyle, a scientific endeavor to better understand the climate, and more lately, climate change, involving sensing instruments, experimental bodies, and institutional networks. Since the late 80s, air pollution maps and visualizations have become essential tools to render the air accountable to governments and citizens. And yet, is the aim of making the environmental visible to represent the truth, as most science and policymaking maps do? Or is it a way of interfering with the world, as Anne-Marie Mould and many STS feminist scholars claim and demand? If you remember in Latour and Wolger's account of the life in the laboratory, they refer to graphs, visualizations as inscriptions that have to circulate in order to gain relevance and interfere with the world. So what they argue is that scientists make these graphs in order to solidify and consolidate their findings and their data. But if it doesn't circulate, if it doesn't reach other institutions, if it doesn't reach academic journals, if they're not known, they lose their power. So in themselves, they're nothing, basically, or they don't have the potential of transforming the object of study, scientific knowledge, etc. But what if the conditions of the project are far away from a scientific lab, and maybe not that far away because it's a media lab? Can visualizations do or interfere in a different way? this project started in 2008, as I mentioned before, and this was the way in which the air was known and the city of Madrid as the case study that we used. This was how the city council communicated air pollution, which was literally giving the air quality index of the average of all the components at the location of the monitoring stations. There's other maps and visualizations that are made by modelers, where what matters is the capacity of prediction. So it's not so much about the point in space, but about systems and flows in order to anticipate futures. But in the air, what we wanted was to reframe the institutional way of displaying air quality through numbers. And what in the air cared for was not only the concentrations in themselves, the measurements, but the relationship of the aerial components in time, space, with another, and the city. For this purpose, we used a topographical mesh as a relational entity, and the different components were interpolated not to see absolute concentrations, but how their levels are related to the limits admitted by the European Union. So it was not about the air as an independent measurement, but as a situated entity, because location and exposures matter in air pollution. By representing the data, we constructed the space that it generates. This drawing or platform or visualizing tool, and we can figure out how to name it, and this has been a challenge throughout the years, but one of the main intentions was to create a landscape that enabled non-experts to inhabit the space of pollution without having to be experts on the numbers, on the figures, but other than that, is to choose where we want to see the air from. How can we, using like really, really basic video game strategies, and here, yeah, this was all a long time ago, and thinking that no one was a professional visualizer when we were doing this project. So we just like tried whatever we could find. But what was very clear was that one of the reasons for drawing differently, if you will, was in order to be able to get closer, whatever that means, to the air. So if some scholars thinking about air pollution and how human bodies feel in the field, let's say as anthropologist Tim Choi or Nick Shapiro, I ask whether this could be an instrument, this drawing, this platform, an instrument to expand these modes of feeling the air through digital sensation. So I've started thinking about these other ways of visualizing data, and it's exactly the same data, and that's really important, as airscapes, as landscapes that allow us to inhabit the data and not only to understand it or to see it. So what I am after is how different ways of designing an aerial map construct what I've called airscapes. Through design decisions, a different story is told, or we wanted to tell a different story, because every line or color requires making a decision that forces us to think how to engage and respond to the object of inquiry, and challenges not only what it is, but most interestingly, and this is really important for me, what things can become. So I understand design decisions as propositional world-making techniques, which can contribute to respond to current critiques to STS as being non-political, and from a feminist perspective, to think about this practice of drawing as a form of care that holds together the object of inquiry, as Maria Puig de la Belcasa has coined. So in this case, instead of presenting the air of pollution, we wanted to present the air of the toxic, where what we can see in real time is the pharmacon capacity of the air, of being good or bad for our bodies and for everything else according to the concentrations. And what we focus on is in the areas where there's environmental injustice. Therefore, not all areas of the city matter the same. Some years later, we created a different iteration, which was called Pollen in the Air. And that brought us to a completely different realm. Because instead of thinking about pollen as a harm to humans, which most of the visualizations that you might see around want to do, that's the aim, to protect our bodies from what is outside. What we wanted to do was to create a more than human and ecosystemic based perspective. So drawing on Hustag and Meyer's work on affective ecologies, where they describe how plants and insects have interactions beyond productivity, where they communicate, have bodily and eventually pleasant interactions, and so on, they understand ecosystemical relations as affective ecologies. So what would be the landscape of a pollen that is in itself a reproductive unit that serves as food for bees, pollinates other plants, flies with the wind, and yes, makes some of us sneeze? What if we change what we want to see? Pollen's airscape is upside down, reversing the human-centered aerial perspective. Humans are floating with bees or pollen particles. Instead of connecting pollen to human health, we cross the data with the dataset of the trees in the city. So when pollen activates, we can see which trees and plants are blossoming at a precise time and location. So it is not the landscape of risk or health prediction, but the landscape of plant, wind, and animal intercourse. With this in mind, we tested another visualization device. Instead of topography, we focused on the impossibility of demarcating the air, and we used particle clouds as a visualization strategy, which from the very beginning, if you will, takes into account the material properties of the air, enacting the air of queer ecologies where multiple species have physical connections that construct various types of effects. So I'll synthesize this in what comes next. Agencies that emerge or are embedded in this way of doing or thinking. The process of making visible can also interfere in its reality, as Donna Haraway has demonstrated by looking specifically at the agency of making visible. Like, what does it mean to make visible? And to take into consideration how the invisible, the object that we think is invisible, asks or allows or refuses to be made visible. Also, how to focus on the responsibility from the visualizer. How to decide what is worth seeing, with whom, for whom, under which conditions, and what our role is as visualizers in engaging with the object matter. Even the point of perspective is really, really important. Like, and I'm sure you know this, which has been referenced before on situated knowledge by Haraway as well. It also redistributes who can know and produce knowledge on air pollution. So from scientific context, we go to citizen science, media labs, social centers, schools, universities, and so forth. But how is this a method? And a method for what? So I draw on this literature mostly on affective methods and affective theory and inventive methods by Lurie and Werkwood, where the method is an open method, more an attitude than a set of protocols, attuned to the messy process of testing and bringing together, taking into account the human and more than human support and care involved in these practices, in the practices of making and visualizing. As Erin Manning notes, each step will be a renewal of how this event, this time, this problem proposes this mode of inquiry, in this voice, in these materials, in this way. At times, in retrospect, the process as developed might seem like a method, but repeating it will never bring it back. For techniques must be reinvented at every turn, and though must always leap. And this is really important because it's a method that allows us to ask questions and to try to understand the ontological conditions of the air. None of us knew anything about air quality or air pollution, but just by thinking whether this is a line or whether this is a dot, you start going deeper and having to research, needing to research and understand what is the difference between CO2 or ozone, for example. Why is CO2 not measured and instead we have CO? It also allows to emerge the socio-technical assemblage of the air. So it's not only particles in the air, but it's institutions that measure, technologies, activists, and so forth. It requires other forms of collaboration, and where the visualization itself can be a boundary object, and this is something that we've seen in other presentations, they become instruments, devices, where sometimes the object of study, if you will, doesn't matter that much, but what it allows is to bring people together, that in social terms, but also in scientific ones. Thinking that, for example, I don't know how to program, so I had to draw without knowing how to, and how do you do that? And other people become absolutely crucial and relevant and needed, because otherwise you just cannot draw. But also as a process that slows down science. So to challenge what do we see when we see the data? What is the data telling us? Why do we take for granted the data that we're receiving? And this slowing down allowed us to think with the air, because we stayed with it. We didn't want to immediately bring a visualization forward, but try to understand first and spend time with it. And of course, to have an experience, something that is so invisible, used to be, not anymore, unfortunately, but how can we experience it, and how can we experience it differently? So for me, this is the most important aspect of this method. That is that with the same data, it allows us to think differently about the air. It allows us to speculate as a tool for world making. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nerea. There's so many great overlaps and connections here. So I'm going to keep us moving along so we can hear from our respondent and then have some discussion. So I'm delighted. I'm totally excited to be able to introduce our last member of the panel here. This Rory Hyde will be the respondent to this session, and then initiate some conversation. So we're super lucky to have Rory Hyde joining us from Melbourne. Rory is a designer. He's a curator. He's a writer, and his work focuses on new forms of design practice, and a lot of it focuses on a kind of possibility or even obligation as designers to engage the public good through a reorganization of that role. Currently, an associate professor of architecture in the curatorial design and practice program at the Melbourne School of Design, and still a design advocate for the Mayor of London. You may know Rory's work from his role as the curator of contemporary architecture and urbanism at the Victoria and Albert from 2013 to 20, which is, I'm sure you know the V&A, one of the most important museums of art and design. And I think what I really admire, one of the many things I really admire about the way Rory approached his work in general, but also there was the way that it seemed like curation became this like a design project and connected to trying to make good on the idea of what it means to work in the public. And so some of the projects, for me, that are really stand out, one is called All of This Belongs to You, and is this neon sign over the entrance to the V&A that is a reminder of what it says, which is this is a public thing. And I think that as a provocation is something that maybe, a curator, your conventional curator, might not think to kind of intervene in the museum in that way. So I really, I think there's an incredible set of kind of inspirational models here to be found in the work that Rory, you're doing. And then the writing is also incredibly important, not just across the kind of various forms of architectural journalism, but in two really key books. The first is as Future Practice, which is a series of conversations with various spatial practitioners working, as the subtitle says, at the edge of architecture. And then most recently, the book I was just quoting from, which is Architects After Architecture, which I think should be required reading for everyone, as we're at this threshold of trying to understand what it is that we're all doing. And so in the context of a conversation about the possibility of expanding agency through drawing, I think this is a kind of perfect place. So I'm so happy you're here, Rory. And you probably got the sense that Rory is someone who's a little bit ahead of things. Right now, he's literally ahead of us, as it's morning in Melbourne tomorrow. So greetings from the past. Thank you for joining us from the future. And it's so nice of you to get up so early to join us for this event. So I'll turn it over to you, Rory. And thank you again.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks for such a wonderful, generous introduction. It's too much. It really is. And thank you to Sandra, to Luke, to Nerea for your wonderful presentations. Maybe it's a good spot to start, actually. As Jesse has mentioned, Architects After Architecture, which is really trying to think about the limits of what we consider to be orthodox architecture. I mean, it's something that you mentioned, Nerea, in your presentation, that in your introduction in relation to your PhD, to defend or to justify it as an architecture, and the work that you're doing in this very ephemeral space above our heads, which is, as you've shown, nonetheless still can be interpreted as very physical and real, and the way that it affects our lives. And similarly, Sandra and Luke, you're looking at video game architecture, which is often easily dismissed by the orthodox gatekeepers of the architectural world as something trivial, as something diverting, rather than something which, as you've shown, shapes the way we think about space and can be a useful tool into a genuine engagement with architecture and with space. So perhaps to put that to each of you, perhaps Nerea, while you catch your breath, I'll point towards Luke and Sandra first. But how do you feel about the way that your work interfaces with orthodox architecture, and is that a space you've had to carve out for yourselves, or do you feel like outcasts?
Thanks, Rory. Honestly, I thought we'd have to work a bit harder to convince people that it was something worth looking at. But fortunately, I think that with the kind of rise of contemporary digital culture and the prevalence of games and how widespread they're becoming, and how everyone that kind of grew up playing games is now grown up. So there's a lot of people who it's something a bit more normal and a bit less like behind closed doors. So that's been really opportunistic for us, I think, to kind of latch onto and position ourselves in between those two worlds.
Yeah, I suppose that a lot of the game engine tools that we use are being used by other practitioners in architecture for, like data analysis, or connecting into Internet of Things, so that the game engine as a technology is kind of really being adopted, more widely in architecture. And I think for us, what's interesting is that the game engine manufacturer or developers are also starting to develop architecture specific tools, but what we also find interesting about those is that those become either systems analysis or visualization at the moment. So in a sense, we're more interested by the raw engine, because the interplay between the rules of being within the world and the representation of the world for us is the really fascinating thing. So I think we've done a lot in our work and our teaching to like look at, you know, the radical groups from the 1960s and 70s and stuff like that, to give a sort of sensibility to the work of this idea of expanding the discipline of making kind of critical projects that are also fantasies at the same time, but speak about the real discipline of architecture as well.
Architects have always dreamed and, you know, made projects that weren't intended to be realized. So I think all that's changed now really is the set of tools that we have, which is what we're kind of playing with.
Thanks, guys. Nerea, did you ever resolve the question that you put to yourself following your PhD as to whether to defend it or to justify it as architecture?
I think there's been two difficulties that have come together. One is speaking about the air as an urgency, if you will. And at the time in 2008, it was like the air was polluted, yeah, but it was not like an urgency as it is now, I think. Of course, everyone was concerned, but it was not in popular culture, if you will. But to think about it as an element of the city that we cannot just ignore, and of the built environment, that was one of the challenges. And the other one would be was thinking about architecture without designing buildings, but designing the air, and that was another challenge. The first one now is resolved because everyone understands that, of course, and this is I have quantitative data on this in who invites me to give talks. And then this year is the year of architecture schools, but it hadn't happened before. It was always like all the from other disciplines. So, but I think what I've learned is that our architecture, our tools as architects, have made this project very specific compared to other projects that have made the air visible. And for some reason, this way has, I don't know, has had an effect, if you will. And I think it's because it was born, as Jesse mentioned, as a necessity. Because I was thinking, oh, I'm just gonna get air pollution data, put it into a model, and then I'm dealing with air pollution. And then when you see the data set, you were like, oh, what is this? What do we know? Like what? And then you start unpacking, and then you start figuring out that we think we know the materials, the elements that we use in architecture, but when you start scratching a little bit, like I didn't know anything about it. So how much do we know about materials? How do we think spatially? The relationship with the city and the built environment? All those are questions that I think are, I mean, everyone knows that are fundamental to architecture, and yet it was difficult to justify that this was doing that as well, and to design the space, because in a way, I mean, with lots of course, it's not, well, I've been doing like installations in trying to design the air, like literally, but to imagine it differently as a design project, basically. And whether it's architecture or spatial or urban, because in Spain, architecture and urbanism are not split as disciplines, and I think this is very important. I know that in other countries this is really, but in our practice, it's just about scale. It's not about how you think about the urban.
Thank you. On your point of who has invited you to give talks, a brief anecdote, which is from Miriam Bellard, who is one of the contributors to the last book that I mentioned, Architects After Architecture, where she studied architecture and then she went on to become the game environment designer for Grand Theft Auto at Rockstar. And when we invited her to speak a few months ago, she said, this is so cool because I've never been invited to speak at an architecture school. You know, this is somebody whose environments have been seen by, I mean, without exaggerating, hundreds of millions of people. I mean, she is the sort of Frank Gehry of virtual space, and yet an architect has never thought to invite her. So, I'm pleased to hear that it's your year of speaking to architecture schools as well. That somehow maybe it's just that we're slow to catch up. We like to wait till other areas have legitimized this work before it lands with us. But I wanted to move to the kind of, I guess the subject of this discussion around agency, which presumes a kind of impact of change or transformation rather than simply documentation or reflection, which is often the role of the drawing. And both of you, Luke and Sandra, in your manifesto in volume, talk about the way that game environments could be used as a kind of democratization project to invite people into participating and thinking about cities in a way that, with a language that is familiar and accessible, as opposed to the language of urban planning. And for you also, Nerea, that making these atmospheres visual is about, as you said, enabling non-experts to inhabit this space of pollution. So I wanted to ask you both, and perhaps we'll go to Sandra and Luke first, about this role that you're playing in kind of expanding the constituents for the spaces that you're imagining.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we kind of feel is a core concern or role. Again, if you look at industry and you look at something like Roblox, which I think a lot of it's not even
my
games
daughter is all over it.
there's this kind of but something like that, and I'm not an expert on it because I think even people in games don't know that some people don't understand the depth of how long this and how deep this thing goes. But the relationship between the sort of consumer and the creator is really kind of blurred in things like that. And I think, if you were to turn architecture into the consumers of architecture, the consumers of cities versus the creators of cities, I think the kind of the blurriness that you see in some of these games, I think to us is really kind of interesting. And there's other kind of precedents as well, like in the use of Minecraft and things like that, and even UN Habitat kind of having these processes where they invite communities to use the game to actually prototype what could be the possibility for their community in a really direct way, and potentially could be sort of there's Minecraft servers where you can connect it to a 3D printer, so potentially these things could be outputted, one-to-one. But I think for us, it's kind of caused us to connect to things like planning regulations or zoning laws or things that are really responsible for shaping cities, but would not be clear unless you kind of understood them fully. And in a sense, the idea of the creativity of the user being something that I think is really intrinsic, especially to contemporary games that are really become like a kind of social platform in themselves, is something I think that we find really interesting, underpinning to the work. And also, I guess, means that you have to design in a way that, again, like we wouldn't consider ourselves to be like full-on game designers, because our games might actually be functionally like not so fun to play, maybe, because that's not necessarily the point, and it probably wouldn't sell a lot if we tried to sell it. But I think that still that kind of idea of the user creativity within a system and what they're allowed to kind of generate and author, for us, I think, is something really powerful. And that doesn't even have to be a game that is literally about someone making something, even how someone moves through a space, and, you know, being able to track them and the decisions that they make and the agency that they have in the world that you've kind of set up, which is like the student drawing we showed, where there's these kind of trails showing all the ways that a player has moved the objects, and kind of maybe they got it wrong and they had to go back. And I think we find that really fascinating as well, because it gives us a kind of direct line into user and habitation.
Yeah, there's lots of things we can learn from the games industry and the way that they kind of analyze and process things. So, you know, play testing, watching someone play a game and learning from it, and how that differs to someone else's experience and the next person's experience and the next one. I think there's some really valuable lessons, I think, that we can take to kind of, start to distort our own methods as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And Nureya, please.
Oh, no. I was going to mention that one of the things that I found fascinating of your work was that you bring. So yeah, I totally understand, and I think it's fascinating that you're saying, well, we put video games in the hands or as a tool to think about planning, for instance, but I was wondering whether, even if you're not creating fully functioning video games, but whether you can also create other imaginaries of what the virtual world can be. And I know nothing about video games, so sorry if, I know that there's some Japanese ones that are not like violent and machistic and whatever, but whether you could create other imaginaries of what the virtual world can be, and I found that really exciting from the images that I've seen, that you're showing like other worlds basically, and I find that super, super powerful, even if it's not like functioning as a video game, and also bringing them to context where we're like decontextualizing them. I think the images at the British Museum at the Tate Britain, what is it, Tate Britain? The V&A.
Victorian Albert.
Excuse me, the V&A. I was bringing them and making us connect the old and the video game and how would you say that? Reframing what a portal might be, for example, and creating all those connections from history to the future. So I think that I found that in your case as a form of intervention of agency that for me has been really, really important to think about how we can create other imaginaries, and the responsibility, but also the luxury to think about, but what do we want to see? If what the others are doing is not useful for us for whatever reason, how can we think about the ethics of knowledge production, which is what Feminist STS has done, and many other critical theory has done very often, which is we just assumed that making visible at the beginning of the project, I was, we need to make visible everything because, and then when you start researching and seeing projects and so forth, what are the implications of doing so? Who loses and who wins? What are these technologies made for? Who sells them? Who benefits from them? What are the consequences? If we think about the tension of inner pollution between being very, very precise, but also not so precise so that a neighborhood can say, well, sorry, but this is horrible. So what is the resolution, if you will, that is acceptable at a political level, at a citizen level? So it creates lots of, so reflecting on that knowledge production I found super useful, and something that we as architects, for example, don't do that much. We just take tools, and that's fast. That's really great. But where the tools come from, who's built them, what are the implications? I found that really, really useful, and I'm using that in design in studios, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the points you make are really, really great. And I think when you were showing, for instance, the way that you were like inverting the city in some of the visualizations in order to kind of reframe the way that we actually look at things, I think to us, there's also something really exciting to see the type of work that you're showing where you're like representing information that would be, invisible before. But as you say, you're not necessarily simulating every aspect of life, because that would be incredibly confusing. There needs to be a kind of clarity over the decisions about how information is presented. But you can also twist that in a way, because as you said, you wanted to change the way that someone looks at it. So you kind of make the world that you show and the data that you show is viewed in a kind of unconventional way in order to sort of demonstrate a point. And I think that that's really definitely something that we also find interesting and a kind of potential of games. And I guess the other thing to say is that, as I said earlier, that we've got colleagues doing stuff in similar software, but doing different things. And I think what the practice and the work that you've been showing, the research is like absolutely perfect for putting into game engines. And in a way, what you're talking about, the imaginaries, now we have the technology to very easily kind of connect like real sensors and real data to imaginary worlds, and to have this kind of conversation between an imagined future and real data and projected data and things like that. And so I think there's definitely a really interesting discipline of sort of, I don't know, futurology, but directly connected into feeds of the current as well, that could be really fascinating. So I think, the points you raised are really interesting. I think we found similarly that the work that you were showing kind of speaks to some of those really interesting connections that are probably still to be made, but are certainly going to happen in the future, it would seem.
Thank you, Luke, Sandra, Nuria, fantastic. We've got a bit of time left, so maybe just a reminder to the audience, to our visitors, that please, if you have a question, throw your hand up. We can jump to you, or you can pop it in the chat, but it will be really nice to get some faces on the screen too, if you're confident and well-dressed enough to ask the question yourself. And I've got a couple of other questions too before we go there. But one of them, perhaps to pick up on this suggestion that Sandra and Luke, you were just discussing around the imagined futures and the role that these game spaces, but also data sets, can play in helping us to project and to think through alternative ways of living or designing the cities. I mean, one of the other ideas that you put forward is around rules and the rule sets which dictate game space, which can be, as you say, more explicit than in the real world, and the ability to change those rules and to change those parameters to speculate on how things might be different. Perhaps you could elaborate further on this point about the kind of collapse of the game space as a diversion to one that could actually begin to prototype other ways of living.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for instance, we made a game that we didn't really show today, but one called Everyone is Architecture. So sort of extending the Hans Hollein quote through to actually thinking of a video game being directly connected to people's bodies. So through kind of tracking and geofencing and technologies like that you could actually turn people into almost architectural components that would be part of a live site. And so, there's obviously things like the new Minecraft game coming out, which is going to kind of touch on different things, but in a way to even connect the act of building to this kind of procedures that we can find very common in video games that have building mechanisms, of which seems to be the most popular ones, all seem to have some kind of building mechanism to them, because it generates it generates this user content. But I think in a way, understanding like a kind of cause and effect behavior that might result through different combinations of people stood next to each other in a physical space that then has this kind of I guess this other character or architectural design that emerges in the virtual is really interesting.
That notion of character and really grasping hold of and celebrating the kind of culture of games and us being able to take on different personas and different characters and that being a kind of driver for engagement, I think is something that we're really keen to do, which for us really grasps hold of why we engage with games as opposed to them just being kind of tools. I think that's something that definitely plays a part in our work and in the way that we want to involve participants and have them kind of play a role, whatever that might be.
No, it's really, that feels really important to me, and especially connects to Nureya's work as well, is this idea of the perspective and the you mentioned SimCity as a prototype or as a precedent for the kind of architecture game. That's the project that they all lead back to somehow, which famously gives you this God's eye view. I mean, what role are you in SimCity? You're the mayor or someone who has power over everything: real estate, infrastructure, finance, and pollution. Famously, that's one of those game factors that can collapse your project. So perhaps back to you, Nureya, then. Who is also actively playing with the perspective, flipping drawings upside down, visualizing your data sets from the ground. How important are those positions, those perspectives, in order to kind of reframe who's responsible for the consequences of air pollution or the agency around air pollution, for instance?
It's crucial. And I think it's crucial in terms of the ethics, but also in terms of the agency of what we're doing. So the first very, very intuitive reason for using this, and it was like a video game, tiny engine of to navigate the space that we used. Well, one of the members of the team brought into the code, basically. And the idea was to have like a very basic experience. So it was literally like, what if we could imagine ourselves inside as something that covers us? So it's not even, it was a really, really basic intuitive condition to, because now with COVID, we're breathing and the space between people is very thick, symbolically, but how can we think the air as matter and not as an empty space? And therefore, perspective allows you, but also one of the reasons why we made it interactive was that it could be used also from the top view for research. So how can we put ourselves also in the position of a researcher? And how can we compare? So it's a tool also to become more interested in the air. But when flipping the ground, it's something so basic. It was a commission for an exhibition on datascapes, and it was interactive as well, and everyone did everything to change it and to put it back again from the top view. It was unbelievable, the difficulty that we have in trying to imagine ourselves in a different position. And we coded it so that it was not possible, and then the facilitators got complaints that the installation was broken because it was so the resistance and that made me wonder how much agency, as you mentioned, seeing it from a different perspective has, just by that very basic move. But also who's looking at things, and to question, and that I realized that it depends not only what the visualization does, but also like who's seeing it. That changes everything, because people perceive it already in a different way. So in some places they were saying, well, the sky is not blue, so I cannot relate to it. This is not the air for me. Like that's too techie or too architectural. Like that's not, and then the perspective didn't mean anything for them, because that was not the main, that was not what made them connect to the air. So it's also very interesting that some things that we consider that are going to be like crucial, then they just go unattended.
Fantastic. Sandra and Luke, did you want to reflect further on the role of the perspective and how in much of your work you introduce a new perspective, whether it's taking the player out of that single point view where they're holding a gun in Grand Theft Auto, and to say, look, there's this whole world here and it has these different systems which you have to operate in, but you may not be aware of until we zoom out.
Yeah, it definitely plays a massive role in the kind of narrative of the game, and where you position the player and what you want to give them control over. And it also, I guess, for us, really plays back into connecting to the history of architectural representation as well, through the way that we communicate space and distort it and represent it. So that's definitely two things that we find really exciting about perspective in relation to games as well.
Yeah, I think that the viewpoint of games, as you said, is kind of really ties to the sort of the power structures as well. And SimCity, the God's Eye view, gives you this kind of omnipotent sort of view over the world that puts the city as a problem to be solved, and that you can actually solve it because you've got this kind of overall view. And maybe some of the more modern games that also do that, they do let you go down to the street level, but you're kind of, you're watching little people walk around, and your ability or their ability to affect your decision is, it can be kind of good in some ways because there's lots of things that you can respond to. But it always makes me think of the student who, I think they were an architecture student who made a self-playing SimCity game. They got the SimCity city to the point where it didn't need to be, they could just leave it and it would kind of run itself. And it was like a sort of totalitarian hellscape with like 90% of the budget spent on policing and things like that, and super high density. And that's when you push the logic of that game to its fullest, it starts to kind of come back at you with that kind of politics, which is quite funny. But I think, as Sandra says, to take something like the first person, which inherently makes the player like the most important person in the world because it's the only set of eyes that you ever embody. It's, of course, it's not entirely dissimilar to your own kind of being, but the world is invariably constructed around the fact that it's going to be seen by this one player in a single player game, at least,
which affects the way that the world is designed and the logics that it holds and the space it takes up and everything like that. So that's really interesting.
But I think the thing that we also started to understand when we used game engine technologies is that when you're flattening something in the space of the camera, it's really similar to like cutting things out of a sheet of sticky plastic and sticking it on your drawing in order to hide or reveal something in a different way. And so, like, for instance, the Projectives game that we made actually essentially like has 4 different cameras that are all projecting onto a series of geometries that are in front of the screen, that's all then viewed by another camera. So there's one camera which is like the camera that views everything flat that's taken from these views in the world. And then so actually this kind of the steps you have to go through to achieve these kind of ways of viewing things are also in themselves a kind of way of viewing, which is like you've got a kind of chain of 3 cameras in order to be able to produce that effect that on the screen hopefully looks like it sort of makes sense as kind of 4 viewpoints coming into one camera, but actually is a bit more complicated when you kind of go behind there. So I think there's a really interesting interface between what you see on the flat screen, or in VR, even, because VR is 2 flat screens just working in a slightly different way, and the way that the world is actually kind of spatially constructed in order to achieve that, which I think we like to play with quite a lot in our work.
Fantastic, thank you. Now we've got a couple of questions coming in, which is good. Mary, you've sent your question to me as a direct message, but if you would like to ask it, that would be fantastic. It's about planning, speculation to the future, and also the pandemic. Is Mary in the house? Otherwise, we have Dean has also just posted another question, which I haven't had a chance to read. It looks to be directed to Sandra and Luke. Dean, are you with us?
I'm with you. Yeah.
Confident and well dressed, I might add.
Thank you. Please take it away.
I'm really enjoying the conversation also between the 4 of you, and the fantastic and inspiring presentations. I have a question for each of the groups or the presentations. I'm curious to hear maybe from Sandra and Luke regarding maybe the potential of this game urbanism that you're working with, which I find really inspiring and interesting, in maybe staging different kinds of urban conflicts, or let's say contested issues in urban contexts, and if the game logic could actually be applied to some kind of negotiation, or could you see potential in that? Maybe that's what you're already working with, and maybe because somehow maybe I'm a kind of dinosaur in how I sort of see games, but I'm wondering whether there are kind of challenges to how the protocols of this kind of logic of how games work might limit that. But I'm really curious maybe to hear more about that. And then I had a question for Nureya. Again, really fantastic presentation, and maybe I was just wondering, and maybe you're also working with this already, but in this notion of information, in how you're working with this discussion of air pollution, is there some way that the next level of information to do with what or whom is causing pollution, and whether this also could be a tool for discussing negotiation or let's say change and those kind of discussions?
Yeah, great. We're happy to answer the first one. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think it's definitely something we always talk about and kind of foreground in conversations about our own projects and student projects as well. Ultimately the players are going to take on a kind of character and or a role in the game, and within those roles come a set of powers, but also a set of constraints, I suppose, which you can really, really control and begin to play with as different players work together. And we've been also looking into the structures of multiplayer games and how you can create virtual platforms or spaces where multiple users are coming together to kind of, again, either collaborate or compete, or a mixture of both. And I think that's something that's really opened up some exciting things in our work recently, and maybe we can refer to the World Game as well. I
mean, I think coming from the earlier point that Rory is making about the different views, we've had projects in the past, like especially in our student studio, where, for instance, one group was looking at a regeneration project in London, and how the disappearance of UK high streets. And so they made a game where one player would be playing as a kind of the citizens association, and one player was playing as the developer, and they both had different viewpoints. I think we're really interested by the asymmetrical nature of some of these relationships. You can't just flatten it out and say we'll make a game where everyone's, well, you can do if you want to make a political statement about that, but also the reality of the situation is that different stakeholders have different positions and different abilities to affect things. But actually the thing that can be changed is maybe those relationships can be changed through communication. So in that game, you had one player playing as a developer who had maybe a different goal, but needed to also be in kind of conversation with the citizens group who had a different agency to change things. Or last year we had a another multiplayer game where it took on the pandemic. So one player is playing as the government, and one player again is playing as like citizens or businesses. So the citizens and businesses have an agency within the framework that the government's offered them, and the government has a generalized point of view. They can affect the world in certain ways, and the other players can affect the world in different ways. And together they're supposed to be kind of working in some kind of relationship. But the game world, what's I think fascinating is there's the world, but then there's also the agent, the players within it, and different players can have different agencies.
Yeah, that project was interesting because they started it in March, literally as we went into lockdown. So they were actually like kind of plugging in real-time lockdown information as well, and seeing how players were responding to that, and having these different logics and rules affect different parts of the city, and showing how the city opens up and closes down as that was actually happening. So yes, I think it's a really interesting tool to be able to do that, to stage these scenarios.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dean, for a really relevant and interesting question. In terms of so in terms of making visible who or what is polluting, we've tried, but it's very difficult because there's no data. And then it gets tricky. So without data, it's tricky to make accusations, very specific accusations on who's doing what. And there's no data for many different reasons, but so the models are made with assumptions of emissions from big polluters, and the monitoring stations measure concentrations per cubic meter. So they're like different things, they're different airs, if you will, that are very difficult to bring together. So we'll wait until there's data on that side. But about the agency of the visualizations, that's something that has been bothering me a lot, because at the beginning the project was the intention of the project was to become a tool for activists to fight for better air, thinking that it would become evidence. It was a tool for evidence, but what we figured out was that it didn't work like that for many different reasons. I think a very important one is that very often we think that just by making a tool available, people are going to use it. And of course, we know that that's not the case. So all the effort, and that's why thinking about it as a socio-technical assemblage is really important, because it's not only that the technology is there, it's that you need to build the social connected to it. And that's a different story. But also thinking that, and this was shocking, after this visualizar between English or Spanish, and I don't know how to pronounce it, visualizar workshop, we went to the council. I always tell this story, but I think for me it's really, really revealing. We went to the council, and the council said, "Oh, no, this is too arty. We cannot present. It doesn't look scientific enough." And we were saying, "What? But it's your data. Like, we haven't done anything." No, but it's not scientific enough. And then one wonders, how does evidence have to look like in order to become evidence? And what are the cultural understandings of what evidence means? So what I've been exploring after thinking about these things has been to move from giving information or evidence of air pollution to try to change the narrative or expand the narrative of what matters in air pollution. So it might not be the concentrations in the air, but where it's more polluted in the city. And that in different projects we've been exploring whether in some projects what is relevant is that the monitoring institutions are cheating, basically. In other contexts, what matters is to think about the otherness of pollution, because in many countries, the media and the government say, well, most of our pollution is transboundary, therefore we are totally fine. It's someone else's fault. And then that's never the case entirely. So how to think about how to bring other questions into the table that might allow us to understand not only the awareness that the air is polluted, but also how can we think about it differently, and how can we, and what are the means to try to do something about it, basically. Maybe a little bit ambiguous, I'm sorry.
No,
Well,
that's
thanks.
fantastic.
Great.
Sorry, Dean, go ahead.
No, I'm done. Thank you very much. Great answers. Thanks.
We've got a little bit of time left, so if there are any other questions, that would be fantastic. But one of the themes that's come through in these recent answers is around the pandemic, and in a way many of us have lived this year almost trying to interpret our decisions through visualizations, whether that be, I remember when we were in London, we would get these maps which told you how many cases are in different parts of the city, and we would say, oh, should we go to the movies? Not really. Should we go for a coffee? Yes. And then you realize later that, oh yeah, of course, all that data was 2 weeks old already, and people are moving around. And then we had these graphs of waves, and somehow it was almost like living within a game, or trying to interpret the atmosphere, which is invisible, through these drawings, architectural drawings. And perhaps each of you could reflect on, the resonances between your research and your experience of this past year, living in the world of graphs and visualizations and flattening curves and so on.
Yeah, for me, my experience has been that everyone has done like a master's in data visualization, because the ways in which now with the second lockdowns, the idea of flattening the curve has completely disappeared, but the first one was just about that, and to think that everyone had to be people got trained to read graphs and to understand what flattening a curve is, and to think about a pandemic in graphic terms. All these graphs comparing different countries, cities, whatnot, areas in the city. So I think that has brought a lot of literacy, if you will, but also it has created a very strange, and I'm speaking about the first lockdown, a very strange abstraction of what was going on, because everything was about like those numbers and we needed to flatten a curve, but yeah, the NHS, but like it was really, really abstract. Numbers of deaths, but also what was very interesting in my understanding was that measuring became crucial, and it's something that we usually take for granted. And then what are we measuring exactly? Which deaths are we measuring? How can we, and all that resolution that is absolutely fundamental if you think about the air, but any environmental condition or anything in general, basically, became very, very, very visible. And from that side, I think it was very, very interesting as well. And then understanding that, of course, the most vulnerable are always the ones that are counting more, being more affected, basically, in anything that we measure in the urban. But also this experience, and I'm going to connect to Luke and Sandra, because the experience of living in a virtual world was kind of this it was disturbing on the one hand and then very exciting on the other, like the amount of things that opened up, but then also the exhaustion and the lack of tools we have to, so we had to relearn how to communicate in many different ways or for many different practices because we didn't know how to do it.
I think
what was your experience?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Sorry, just under a flight path, a really noisy plane. That's a really interesting point because I think probably it forced everyone to start connecting in different ways. Otherwise, you'd just be super lonely. And yes, they're exhausting, but I think that change has probably made a longer term impact than we think. Even if things do start to get better and we do start meeting again in person and these things become a bit redundant, I think that they are going to have an effect. How we work and connect now will have an effect on how we will work and connect later on as well. Already talking about, blended learning environments and blended things and getting rid of some of the old ways of working that we used to do in place of these new ones. Even if we are allowed to meet, do we want to meet? Do we need to meet? I think there's some really interesting longer term impacts that are going to happen.
Yeah, maybe it's a bit of a crass comparison, but as you said, in games, you sometimes have these kind of really fantastical and amazingly fleshed worlds, and then there's a little marker that says you need to run over here to go and speak to this person to get to the next bit of the story. And so suddenly we had this kind of overlay in our real world where you're going out to the shops, you're doing all these things that you take for granted as being like a relatively smooth experience, as smooth as it can be in like London, for instance. But suddenly the world has been given this overlay and you're really aware of like what 2 meters is, and you're really aware of like the boundary between you and someone who's like checking your groceries and things like that. And in a sense it almost feels a bit more like playing a game because there's this kind of overlay that's really dictating what you should and shouldn't be doing, and to not be acting in the way that's been prescribed and marked out for you is to be transgressive in some way. And I think there was something kind of interesting about that experience. But I think, as Sandra said as well, the communication. I mean, for us, we've found it really entertaining to watch things like the Met Museum in New York, like put some of its most famous works into Animal Crossing so that people can download them to put in their islands, because Animal Crossing has become this sort of peaceful moment for people to have these kind of collective experiences. And the fact that this kind of really cutesy game with little animals has become this kind of life raft for loads of people, and also then brought games to a mainstream attention as being that escapism could be a positive thing, because we really kind of need that at this point in time. But also as a venue for communication. I think in the last year it's been really heartening for us and our studio, because we can show our students what's going on. And sometimes they could come to us in the first week of university and say, why am I making video games on a urban design course? But you can then say, well, look at Animal Crossing and the direct communicative and cultural sphere that's built around itself. Why wouldn't you then in that case? So I think in some ways there's been some really interesting stuff to emerge as well, even though we prefer it didn't happen, obviously, but
got to look at the positive side, I suppose.
Could I add in?
Jesse, go ahead. I was going to say that felt like a good moment to hand back to you. So.
Okay, perfect. I mean, there's so much richness here, and I've really been enjoying the conversations. I have a lot of it's just like generated a lot of questions and comments for me, and I think. So thank you both for that. And I mean, maybe these aren't necessarily questions, because I think maybe this is a good moment to work toward wrapping up for the day. But I do think the conversation that's been going on around the kind of intersection of simulation and subjectivity in both projects seems to me quite rich around some of the methodological questions that we've been trying to ask. I mean, I think that the prior session, some of the questions that came up were around the kind of the detached orthographic parallel projection view of urban documentation that Dean and Charlotte were using to describe their interests, but also the way that those things became entry points to some other set of systems. And so I think that here, the kind of inverse of the centered perspective, but then the possibilities of kind of weirding that through the ways that simulation can then also open on to other forms of empathy or perspective, or that, you know, to be able to kind of understand your one's perspective as a particle of pollen moving through the city, or the kind of counterintuitive logics that one can inhabit, and the space of the video game as the space where one can kind of test out ethically questionable kinds of impulses as a way of thinking through or reflecting on one's own, you know, moral compass or ethical compass. So I mean, I think that the possibilities here in terms of the sort of research is so rich, but then also I think as drawings, I mean, I'm so excited about this Animal Crossing documentation project because of the way that it treats the thing as almost like a found artifact, you know, like not so much a historical project but really like looking just at this entity and trying to make sense of it in the same way I think Nuria trying to make sense of the particles. So I think that for me I'm really grateful for the contribution, because it seems to me expanding a way we think about what our relationship is to data and how that gets translated graphically. And I think the other thing I would add, just as a final thing, is the role of the media itself. And I think you both mentioned that you have this relationship to drawing through your own training, as you know, all three of you, I should say, sorry, that you know, from a kind of practice point of view or educational point of view, even the kind of hand drawing work, but then the kinds of images that we're talking about. What do we call them? You know, and I think and why does it matter? And I think one of the things that I find useful about that is the kind of category switches that one can apply, and when one applies different categorical designations, what that does. So you know, that on one hand you could see these things as drawings, but then also they're digital translations of code into things we recognize as images. But it's not graphite on a page or ink on Mylar. It's pixels on a screen or something, and that's sort of, you know, an elementary, I guess, kind of like media theory idea. But in terms of how we understand them as drawings, I think that's why I appreciate Nuria's invocation of the inscription and the way that inscriptions circulate and the power of circulating inscriptions around these things. Because it struck me that one could call what Luke and Sandra are doing are visualizations, and Nuria, what you're doing are games, but maybe just not super popular yet. But, you know, but the way that the kind of the way that the thing we call it could change the way it's used. Because I think that something, it seems like to me, the video game is a sort of inferior, it doesn't totally satisfy as a designation because there's so much space for creativity there as kind of a cultural product. But I think that that all of them, I think, bring forward some reminders and possibilities of how the role of the kind of graphic translation can do work in the world. And so I think that's, for me, a really powerful set of contributions. So thank you to Sandra, to Luke, to Nuria, to Rory for creating space for this conversation. It's really very exciting, and one that I think that we'll pick up in the morning. Which, by the way, just one final note: the question, I was having a conversation with Nishat, who will be in the final session about resolution, exactly around the role of the pixel and the role of the pixel in the satellite image, and even the kind of early forensic architecture work where they understand that the kind of human is effectively a kind of pixel scale thing at the resolution of a satellite, and how that becomes, you know, incredibly sort of either problematic or convenient depending on what you're trying to understand or obscure. So that there's these translations around all of the forms that drawing takes through the kind of limitations of the media itself. And so I think that there's a lot of potential overlap here. So thank you guys again very much for everything.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks
It's
for having
been
us.
fun. Thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
nice to see you all.
Nice to see you all.
Fantastic. So we'll see you all tomorrow morning for session 3 about heuristics with Yvonne Santoro-Orozco and Jingru Cyan Cheng, moderated by Marina Otero. So thank you everybody for joining, and it's been a great day. Looking forward to day 2. So take care.
Thanks, Jesse.
Take care of yourselves.
Bye.
Look away from the screen.